You wake, and the first thought that crosses your mind is not of duty, nor of the Emperor's glory, nor of the ship's chronometers ticking another day into the endless void. The first thought is absence, a silence where something should be, a gap in your awareness you cannot name, like the space where a tooth once was, that your tongue keeps returning to. My name is Lucien Vere. I served as a lieutenant commander aboard the Imperial Navy cruiser Righteous Indignation, a dictator-class warship that had borne the Emperor's will through the stars for 3 centuries before I ever walked her decks. For 12 years, I carried out my responsibilities with the cold exactitude expected of an officer trained on Bacca, where hesitation is branded as heresy and efficiency is a form of worship. I understood the weight that rested on my shoulders. Every order measured in lives, every course correction a gamble with 40,000 souls entrusted to my judgment as we sailed through the warp's spiteful currents. Yet somewhere in those 12 years, between the 100th compliance action and the 1000th inspection of plasma relays, something began to hollow out inside me. It was small at first, a moment during morning devotions when the familiar words turned dry and tasteless in my mouth. A pause before issuing an order, not born of doubt, but of a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else wearing my face, living my life. The void between the stars changes people, but not in the lurid way the cautionary tales describe, all horns and mutation and obvious damnation. This was subtler, a kind of spiritual erosion, like wind chewing away at stone until one day the cliff simply collapses. I can still recall the day it truly began. We had just completed a flawless boarding action against an orc raider, by the book, minimum casualties, maximum commendations, the sort of engagement that feeds recruitment posters and sermons. The crew was elated, filling the passages with laughter, boasting, and the clatter of weapons being cleaned and reassembled. By all rights, I should have felt pride, satisfaction, the quiet warmth of duty fulfilled. Instead, there was nothing. Later, alone in my quarters, I stood before the armored viewport and stared at the scatter of distant suns. I laid my palm flat against the cold bulkhead. The chill bite of the metal, the sharp sensation where the edges of the hull plating caught my skin, that felt immediate and real in a way nothing else had for months. I pressed harder until the ridges dug into my flesh, and in that lance of pain I felt more alive than I had in weeks. That night I dreamed of whispers. They did not come as words at first, but as impressions, strokes of sensation brushing against the limits of my awareness like silk over bare skin. In the dream, I stood within an impossible chamber of twisted angles and paradoxical geometry. Every surface thrummed with its own note, forming a strange music that vibrated through my bones. The air tasted of honey and copper. Then a voice emerged from the harmony, beautiful and dreadful in equal measure. Speaking my name with such perfect precision, it seemed to resonate in my marrow. Lucian, it said, and the sound felt like coming home to a place I had never known existed. You hunger, don't you? You thirst for something beyond the colorless grind of duty. I can show you sensations that would bring a saint to tears of joy. I jolted awake, lungs dragging in air, my heart battering my ribs. The dream clung to me afterward, like an invisible perfume, sweet, suffocating, impossible to shake. I told myself it was nothing more than accumulated stress and too many years adrift between stars. Yet as I moved through my morning rituals, shaving with the same worn razor I had used for a decade, I caught myself pressing the blade into my skin with just a trace more force than required. The faint sting of the cut was exquisite. The changes crept in from there. I began taking longer routes through the ship, seeking out places where the hull sang in different tones as we plowed through the void. The engineering decks, where the plasma reactors roared with chained fury. The observation galleries, where the silence of the void pressed against the viewports with suffocating intimacy. Each location had its own subtle symphony, and I found myself cataloguing these impressions with the same exacting care I once reserved for fleet maneuvers and firing solutions. My subordinates noticed, though not the true nature of the change. That was far too gradual and refined for them to grasp. What they sensed were the consequences. I spoke more deliberately, choosing phrases that carried an almost tangible weight. My orders acquired a new timbre. Something in my voice compelled attention, drew eyes and ears toward me. With careful modulation, I learned that a reprimand could feel like a caress, and a simple commendation could leave the recipient glowing with something close to religious ecstasy. The moment I truly understood that something fundamental had shifted came during evening prayers in the ship's chapel. Chaplain Marcus was leading us through the litany of duty, his booming voice battering the vaulted ceiling. But under the familiar cadence, I heard something else, a hidden melody. Soft, sultry, threading through the prayer and turning it into something dangerously close to sensual. The incense, once simply a symbol of sanctity and tradition, now carried undertones of exotic spices and forbidden pleasures. I glanced at the other officers, faces composed in proper reverence, and realized I was alone in hearing this secret music, alone in smelling those phantom scents. That realization should have filled me with terror. Instead, my hands trembled with anticipation. That night, I made my first deliberate choice to lean into the change. Back in my quarters, with the calm precision of a man conducting a controlled experiment, I began testing the limits of sensation. I started small, the feel of my uniform cloth dragged across skin, prickling with expectation, the way the lumen light carved shifting patterns of shadow that seemed to move with intent. The taste of recaf, which transformed from a rote stimulant into a layered orchestration of flavors unfurling on my tongue like strange flowers. Within days, I escalated my experiments. I discovered that pain, correctly measured and placed, could rise above simple suffering into something approaching rapture. A stylus pressed into my palm until blood welled. The sharp corner of a data slate traced along the tender inside of my wrist. Each new stimulus was a revelation, a fracture in the dull stone of routine through which a fiercer light seeped. But it was not enough. It was never enough. The whispers grew more frequent, no longer confined to sleep. They bled into my waking hours, promising delights beyond nerve and flesh, experiences capable of rewriting the very fabric of reality. They spoke of others who had walked this path, mortals who had cast off the chains of flesh and obligation to become something both glorious and monstrous. They never ordered. They never demanded. They simply offered, patiently, understanding that the most enduring corruption must sprout from within. My performance began to falter, though not in ways my superiors could easily quantify. I still discharged my duties with apparent competence, reports precise, schedules maintained. Yet my focus had shifted. Where once I had chased efficiency and results, I now found myself drawn to the aesthetic of command. The graceful sweep of a maneuver that rolled our broadsides into just the right angle. The orchestrated destruction as our guns unmade an enemy hull into incandescent scrap. The blend of fear and awe in a subordinate's eyes when I devised particularly inventive discipline for failure. I took a more personal role in maintaining order aboard the righteous indignation. The ship had always enforced strict standards, but under my influence, punishments became artful. A rating court asleep at his post found himself confined in a chamber whose mirrors and lumen angles I had arranged to bombard his senses, driving him into euphoric exhaustion. What should have been torment became an experience he later begged me to repeat. A petty officer who mouthed off polished the same stretch of corridor for 18 hours without pause. I showed her how to focus on the rhythm of the motion, how to surrender herself to it until the toil became a kind of ecstatic meditation. She finished the task, weeping with gratitude for the honor I had bestowed. The crew saw these changes, but their reaction was not revulsion. They were fascinated. When I spoke, they leaned forward, hungry for each word. When I walked the passageways, conversation halted, not from formal respect, but from breathless expectancy. They began to jockey for my regard, to compete for my notice, my touch, my praise. I understood then that whatever was unfolding within me was extending outward. My very presence had become addictive, an intoxicant they could not name. The knowledge filled me with dark delight. The true breakthrough came during what should have been a mundane inspection of the ship's Vox systems. I was alone in the communications chamber, surrounded by consoles breathing low, constant static. As I ran diagnostic routines, I realized the sound between channels was not as chaotic as it should have been. Patterns lurked in the noise, structures closer to music than interference. I adjusted the receivers, tuning and refining until those hidden threads stood alone. What I heard altered everything. It was a symphony of pure sensation, a composition existing in the slivers between waking and dream. Each note reverberated through my entire body, awakening nerves and pathways I had never been aware of. The music hinted at possibilities beyond sane comprehension, pleasures capable of shattering a mind, a realm in which every desire could not only be met, but surpassed. I listened for hours, unmoving, thoughts stretching to encompass alien concepts of beauty and horror. When I finally powered down the systems, the ordinary world was reduced to a faded imitation. Colors appeared washed out, sounds dull and lifeless, even the air felt thin, insufficient. That was when I heard her clearly for the first time, not as a suggestion, not as a half-formed whisper, but as a direct communication from something vast, terrible, and breathtakingly beautiful. "My dear Lucian," she crooned, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. Sweet, cutting, lethal. "You have come so far, so quickly, but this is only the threshold. There are depths of experience awaiting you that would make your recent discoveries seem like a child's fumbling. All I ask is that you trust me. Let me lead you beyond the prison of mortal flesh." I knew what I was supposed to do. Every lesson from the Schola, every oath sworn before icons, every rote prayer insisted that I should recoil, summon the chaplain, throw myself upon the mercy of purification. Instead, in the darkness of the Vox chamber, I sank to my knees and whispered my assent. From that point, the transformation accelerated. My senses sharpened past natural limits. I could taste emotions in the air, see the currents of desire and fear streaming through the corridors like faint, luminous tides. The crew's fixation on me deepened into something perilously close to worship, though none of them understood what had changed. I experimented with this influence, learning to mold the emotional climate around me as an artist reshapes clay. A carefully timed word, a particular gesture, a brief touch, a measured look. These were enough to transmute anger into yearning, fear into fascination, duty into desperate, almost frantic devotion. Discipline aboard ship did not break, it evolved. Orders were obeyed not just from obligation, but from a feverish need to please me. The first time I killed purely for pleasure was during another boarding operation, this time against a heretic vessel. We were clearing compartment after compartment, close-quarters firefights in twisting, filthy halls. I drove one of their warriors, a scarred woman etched with obscene symbols, into a cramped storage bay. By doctrine, she should have died quickly. A clean kill, efficient and without waste. Instead, I paused. Her fear resculpted her features, turning her face into something almost artistic. I became fascinated with the nuances of her terror. The tiny shivers, the widening of the pupils, the way her breath hitched into ragged gasps. I stretched her death across 17 long minutes, every cut calculated to maximize her sensations while prolonging her awareness. Her screams changed, becoming something less like human wailing and more like a twisted hymn. In her final breaths, comprehension dawned in her eyes. She tasted the same strange transcendence through agony that I had found in pleasure. Her whispered gratitude as she died was more intoxicating than any narcotic. When my squad arrived and found me standing over her corpse, all they saw was another dead enemy and their officer victorious in single combat. They could not perceive the way reality itself had shimmered and flexed around me during those perfect moments, or how the border between myself and the universe had blurred. After that, I chased similar experiences with a growing, gnawing hunger. The memory of that flawless, elevated instant haunted me. Ordinary sensation was no longer enough. I needed greater extremes to reach the same heights. I volunteered for every boarding, every personal combat action, every scenario that might offer new avenues of experience. But over time, even killing lost its edge. What had once sent me spiraling into ecstasy became merely pleasant. I needed more, always more. An endless escalation that promised fulfillment but delivered only deeper craving. My quarters became both laboratory and shrine. I positioned mirrors to catch my reflection from every angle, watching subtle changes creep across my features, refining them into something disturbingly perfect. I hoarded trophies from our triumphs, chosen not only for their beauty, but for the new sensations they could provide. A ceremonial blade that produced different notes depending on the depth of the cut. A silk banner that flowed over skin like liquid fire, leaving after images of touch that lingered for hours. Every surface offered back my own ever more exquisite image, feeding a vanity that expanded with every glance. The dreams came every night now, no longer hazy but painfully vivid. I wandered palaces of impossible design, where every wall was warm against my fingers and the air was thick with raw desire. I attended performances where the music was so ravishing it could kill those who were unprepared, the notes hanging in the air as tangible motes that could be plucked and consumed. I feasted on impossible foods that detonated across my senses, each bite a small, ecstatic death followed by rebirth. She visited me often in these visions, no longer content to be just a voice. Her appearance shifted with each encounter. Sometimes she came as a woman of incomparable beauty, skin pale as starlight, eyes deep enough to hold galaxies. At other times, she was less comprehensible, a pattern of sensation, a living lattice of desire that bypassed flesh entirely and spoke directly to the mind. "You see it now, don't you?" she asked during one especially searing encounter. "The Emperor offers you salvation through suffering, through denial, through the dreary sameness of duty. What has that ever truly given you? What joy has his service brought? I offer something far greater, the full realization of every possibility within you. Pain and pleasure, creation and destruction, every boundary dissolved into perfect experience. I wanted to protest, to recite my vows, to claim loyalty to the life I had lived. But the words withered on my tongue. How could I refute her when I had tasted even a fragment of what she promised and found it richer than decades of sterile faith? By then, the corruption had burst its confinement in my dreams and private ceremonies. It began bleeding into everyday life. In briefings, I spoke with a cadence that turned tactical discussions into haunting verse. My tone wrapped simple operational plans in a sense of inevitability. Officers who might once have questioned a proposal felt their objections evaporate, nodding along without understanding why. I discovered I could seed small hallucinations in others with nothing more than voice and gesture. A lowly rating would glimpse flowers blooming along the corridor walls, impossible blooms that existed solely in his perception but felt more solid than steel. A tech priest would hear elaborate harmonies woven through her machine hymns, driving her to frantic, fevered attempts to recreate them in her devotions. These phenomena were always minor, always plausibly explained away as fatigue or stress, the natural fraying that comes from too much time in interstellar transit. But I knew better. Reality was starting to bend around me. The ship itself changed. Stern, utilitarian passageways took on a faintly inviting character. Shadows grew deeper, more suggestive. The chapel's incense developed new inflections, making worship feel less like obligation and more like celebration. Even the food synthesizers began producing meals whose flavors were more intricate and satisfying than their programming should have allowed. My fellow officers started competing for my attention without fully understanding why. Some lingered after meetings, inventing reasons to remain in my orbit. Their clothing, their posture, their speech subtly shifted as they unconsciously imitated pieces of my manner. Lieutenant Saxis began styling her hair in a way that drew more focus to her eyes. Commander Thaddeus started weighing his words more carefully, reaching for the polished eloquence he heard in my voice. They were being infected simply by standing too close to me, though none of them could see the pattern. I could. The realization washed over me in a confusing blend of shame and exhilaration. Shame, because I knew I was betraying everything I had once held sacred. Duty, loyalty, service. Exhilaration, because I had begun to reshape not just men and metal, but the very texture of reality around us. And that was a power more intoxicating than any pleasure I had ever pursued. The moment from which there was no going back came during our engagement with a chaos cult on the hive world Malthus. The righteous indignation had been assigned to provide orbital fire support for the Imperial Guard as they conducted purification operations on the surface. On paper, it was routine, just another compliance action like dozens I had overseen before. Yet as we settled into orbit, I felt something reaching up from the planet. Not a voice this time, but a vibration, a harmonic note that resonated perfectly with whatever my soul had become. Ignoring every protocol and instinct I'd once held sacred, I requested permission to personally lead a reconnaissance mission into the upper spires where cult activity had been reported. Captain Alexandros agreed, though confusion flickered behind his eyes. The task was trivially within the abilities of junior officers. There was no practical justification for a lieutenant commander's involvement. But my words no longer carried only meaning, they carried weight. And his doubts faltered before he could voice them. I selected a small squad of hand-picked troopers, men and women who had proven most receptive to my influence over the preceding months. We descended in a Valkyrie through layers of toxic cloud that stained the sky the color of dried blood. Below us, Malthus Prime rose from the poisoned landscape, a rusting forest of towers and hab blocks, the hive's spires clawing at the heavens like the fingers of a giant sinking beneath sludge. Our destination was Spire Luxuria, once a noble district, now rumored to be fully in the grip of the cult. The closer we came, the stronger that unseen presence pulled at me, like a hook lodged behind my sternum. We breached the spire's perimeter and began to move upward through its levels, climbing into zones where the architecture no longer obeyed rational function. The cult had been remaking the place in their own image. Former palatial suites and ballrooms had been reshaped into warped reflections of the palaces from my dreams. Walls were carved with flowing, organic designs that seemed to twitch and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. Heavy incense saturated the air, laced with notes of longing, delirium, and something like madness. My squad advanced with tightening grips on their weapons and eyes full of unease, but not one of them hesitated. Their loyalty to me had passed beyond rank and regulation into something far more personal. If I had ordered them to march into the warp itself, they would have obeyed. Perhaps, in a sense, I already had. We discovered the cult's inner sanctum in what had once been an opulent ballroom. The chamber had been reinvented as a temple to sensation. Mirrors lined the walls, but they did not reflect our bodies. Instead, they showed flickers of private wants, hidden fantasies, things their owners had never dared admit even to themselves. The floor was buried beneath cushions and draped in silks of impossible hues, fabrics that seemed to emit their own subdued light. At the center stood an altar carved from a single slab of obsidian, its polished surface as flawless as still water. The cultists were waiting, but not in battle order. They knelt in postures of reverence, their faces turned toward me with an intensity that felt almost painful. Their leader rose to meet us, a woman whose beauty had been refined to inhuman levels, flesh sculpted toward an ideal no baseline human could ever naturally achieve. She extended her hands in welcome. "We have been expecting you, Lucien Veillard," she said. Her voice contained harmonies that set my altered senses thrumming with recognition. "She has been preparing us for your coming. We are ready to serve, ready to learn, ready to abandon the prison of mortal flesh." By every law and lesson I had ever learned, I should have ordered my squad to open fire that instant. These were heretics, apostates, enemies of humanity. The correct response was cleansing flame and bolt rounds, no questions, no hesitation. Instead, I stepped forward. The altar's surface was etched with symbols that refused to remain still. Geometric patterns that shifted as I watched, shapes that hurt to focus on, yet carried meaning too large for spoken language. I placed my hand upon the stone. It felt like closing a circuit that had been waiting for my touch since time immemorial. Everything I had been keeping compartmentalized, duty over here, secret explorations over there, collapsed into one. The constant whispers that had haunted my sleep surged into a deafening chorus of rapture, and in that instant I finally comprehended the true identity of the entity that had been nurturing my fall. She was not just some isolated demon or wandering scrap of warp energy. She was sensation, the conscious embodiment of experience itself, pleasure and agony and every shade that lies between. The patron of excess, the dark prince, the flawless one whose realm encompasses every way in which awareness can be stretched beyond its mortal limits. Slaanesh. In that single contact, she showed me visions that made everything I had tasted so far seem pale and thin. I saw worlds where pain and pleasure had fused into one continuous, sublime state. Civilizations where individuals had dissolved into a shared, luminous sea of sensation more beautiful than anything the Emperor's brutal order could ever offer. I witnessed the births of experiences without names, emotions so intricate and layered they would shatter an unprepared mind. My precious Lucian. Her voice purred through every part of me, no longer external but threaded into my own thoughts. Look at what you have made of yourself. See how exquisitely you have shaped your being into something worthy of my gaze. This is only the first step toward the perfection I can bring you. Every act of transcendence makes you more radiant, more deserving of what I grant. I turned back toward my squad. In their eyes I saw more than confusion or fear. I saw recognition, awe, hunger. My features had been refined into a kind of razor-edged beauty that was physically painful to look at for more than a moment. My skin seemed to emit its own soft glow. When I spoke, there were tones beneath my words that slithered past conscious thought and ignited desires the listeners had never dared acknowledge. "My friends," I said, and the syllables seemed to take on shape and color as they left my mouth. "We have found something beyond duty, beyond the Emperor's distant, frigid promises. We have found truth." One by one, they sank to their knees, faces mirroring the same starving need I had seen in the cultists. The corruption flowed outward, a contagious ecstasy that altered everything it touched. I could see it happening even as I watched, their bone structures refining, their movements becoming fluid and controlled, their eyes gaining depths that hinted at pleasures and revelations not yet realized. The cultists began to sing, weaving a tapestry of sound so rich the air itself seemed to quiver. The mirrors around us no longer reflected individuals at all, but our souls in mid-metamorphosis, showing not who we had been, but what we were in the process of becoming. In those images I saw creatures of staggering beauty, beings that had stepped beyond the limits of humanity into something gloriously and irredeemably damned. I remained in that temple for 3 days. In that time, the cultists who had already walked this path tutored me. They showed me how to push sensation beyond the crude boundaries of nerve and sinew, how to layer perceptions so that multiple streams of reality could be experienced at once. They taught techniques for sharing experiences directly from mind to mind, bypassing the clumsy bottleneck of speech. Each lesson rewrote my understanding of existence, and each birthed new appetites screaming to be fed. I learned how to taste color. Very quickly, ordinary shades dulled. Common pigments flattened into boredom, driving me to seek ever more impossible hues. I learned to see music as shifting, crystalline geometry, but soon simple tunes turned into grating noise, and I craved endlessly more intricate harmonies, so intense they bordered on pain. I learned to merge consciousness with another, to feel their memories and sensations as my own, and afterward, normal human interaction felt hollow, like brushing against shadows projected on a wall. When we finally returned to the righteous indignation, we carried the taint back with us like a plague. I stopped pretending, stopped masking the changes in myself. My quarters became a sanctum of excess, overflowing with art, relics, and devices, chosen for the new truths they embodied. I altered my uniforms with barely legal embellishments, small adjustments that enhanced elegance without technically violating regulations. The reaction from the crew was immediate and overwhelming. Curiosity hardened into adoration. Respect turned into devotion. Officers began lobbying to be assigned to my command. Ratings volunteered for extra shifts if it meant a chance to be near me. Even the ship's tech priests started allowing aesthetics to influence their work, modifying rituals and layouts so that the engine rooms and machine shrines became pleasing to the senses, as well as functional. Captain Alexandros held out the longest. Years of command and a deeply ingrained faith gave him a measure of resistance, but even he could not remain untouched by what was happening aboard his vessel. I watched him wrestle with it, confusion growing as he saw his crew's loyalty shifting subtly from the Emperor and the Navy toward me. Efficiency and morale soared to heights we had never recorded before, even as adherence to orthodox doctrine softened. His final surrender came during a confrontation in his ready room. He had summoned me to address irregularities in my conduct and in the behavior of those under my influence. He sat behind his desk, posture stiff, projecting the authority of long service. But his eyes betrayed him. "Lucian," he began, and even my name lacked the firmness he intended. "I've received troubling reports about changes aboard this ship. Crewmen describing visions, claiming experiences beyond normal human perception. There are whispers that you may somehow be involved." I let a faint smile curve my lips and simply held his gaze. He leaned toward me before he realized he was doing it, drawn like a moth that doesn't yet understand the nature of fire. "Captain," I said softly, my tone calibrated with surgical precision. "Have our performance metrics fallen? Has discipline weakened? Are my people anything less than utterly committed to their duties?" He glanced down at his data slate, brow furrowing. "No. If anything, performance has improved. Dramatically. But it's unnatural. As if they've discovered some new source of motivation that has nothing to do with duty or fear of punishment. Is that not worthy of celebration?" I reclined slightly, letting the light slide over the subtle alterations I had made to the aquila on my chest. The flowing lines drew the eye, pulling his attention down pathways he didn't understand. Surely the Emperor is pleased when his servants take joy in their work, when they surpass every expectation through sheer devotion. His gaze fixed on the decorations, tracing their curves. I watched his breathing deepen, his pupils widen. The first stirrings of hunger were unmistakable. "Yes, of course," he said slowly. "The Emperor demands dedication from his children. It's just these reports. Ratings claiming to see impossible beauty in the corridors, to hear harmonies in machine hymns that shouldn't exist. These sound like signs of what, Captain?" I let my voice drop to something just above a whisper, yet it filled the room more completely than if I had shouted. "Of a crew who have discovered the true glory of service, warriors who fight with passion rather than mere obedience. Servants who perceive the divine in everything, not just in sanctioned rites. My words seemed to vibrate in the air between us. I could see the defenses he had built over a lifetime collapsing grain by grain. His hand rose to his collar, fingers worrying at the fabric as if it had suddenly become too tight. "The things they describe," he murmured now, the hard edge gone from his tone, replaced by a raw curiosity. "The visions, the sensations, is it possible they are real? That they are encountering something the rest of us are too blind to perceive?" I rose and moved around his desk, every step a deliberate study in grace. I felt him battling the urge to pull away, even as he was rooted in place by the need to stay. "Captain Alexandros," I said, resting my hand lightly on his shoulder. The contact sent a visible tremor through him. "What if I told you that all of it is true? That there exist strata of reality the Mechanicus' crude materialism can never touch? Dimensions of experience so rich that our current lives are nothing more than drab shadows by comparison." His eyes widened, and I watched the precise instant when rational discipline cracked and the deeper, more primal longing seized control. His features sharpened before my eyes, his movements grew subtly more fluid. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired nascent harmonics of its own. "Show me," he whispered. In those two words, I heard the same desperate need that had once driven me. From there, the ship's transformation did not merely accelerate, it entered a new phase. With the captain now openly under my sway, competition broke out across every deck. Crew members strove to display their progress, each trying to surpass the others in heightened perception, refined aesthetics, and ever more elaborate expressions of devotion. Worship services mutated into exercises in sensory extremity, pushing the boundaries further with each iteration. Routine tasks became baroque rituals. Weapon racks arranged like curated sculptures. Combat drills executed with such obsessive precision that participants collapsed afterward in exhausted ecstasy. Other Imperial vessels began to notice. Their messages grew sharper, more urgent, as our deviations from standard protocol multiplied. Our replies, even when technically compliant, carried undercurrents that unsettled and intrigued them in equal measure. The contagion spread beyond our hull. Junior officers on visiting ships requested transfers after only brief exposure to my crew, claiming life-altering insights gained from a single conversation or shared ceremony. The Mechanicus delegation aboard the Righteous Indignation underwent their own metamorphosis. Their binaric cant started to incorporate tonal patterns, turning machine code into a form of music. They reconfigured servo skulls with flourishes that served no functional purpose whatsoever, purely to create pleasing motion and form as the constructs drifted through the corridors. Even their augmetics grew more elegant, melding metal and flesh in designs that transcended mere practicality. But it was not until our encounter with the word-bearers that I fully grasped the scale of what I had become. We had been shadowing their vessel, the Crimson Apostle, through the Morian sector when it abruptly tore free of the warp directly ahead of our formation. I braced for the inevitable battle. It did not come. Instead, their commander, a Chaos Lord styling himself Kelthus the Enlightened, requested direct contact. His image filled our main display, a towering figure whose every mutation testified to centuries of unwavering service to the Dark Gods. When his gaze settled on me, I saw something I had never expected from such a creature. Recognition, and something very close to respect. "Lucien Vea," he said, his voice laden with the authority of a warrior who had fought since the galaxy was young. "Your reputation has preceded you. The Prince of Pleasure speaks with admiration of her newest champion." His words struck me like a blow of pure delight. To be acknowledged by an ancient veteran of the Long War, to be named champion in the sight of the Dark God's servants. This was validation beyond anything I dared imagine. "Lord Kelthus," I replied, allowing my voice to carry the layered tones I knew even he could sense. "Your regard honors me. I fear I've only begun to scratch the surface of what she has granted." The chaos, Lord's mangled features twisted into what might have been a smile. Perhaps. Yet what you have achieved in such a short span speaks to extraordinary promise. Tell me, would you be interested in joining our efforts in an upcoming undertaking? There is a world in this sector whose people stubbornly refuse enlightenment. Your particular gifts may help them recognize the beauty they have long denied. The offer was intoxicating. To stand beside the legendary warriors of chaos, to help reshape entire worlds as I had reshaped a single ship, to propagate the exquisite corruption that had transformed me. It was everything I had come to crave. I would be honored to serve, I answered, and felt the righteous indignation seem to shudder with shared anticipation, as if the vessel itself exulted. The target was Sancto Seven, a shrine world whose population had clung fiercely to imperial worship through centuries of privation. The word-bearers had been working upon it for decades with only minimal success. The people's rigid, joyless faith made them unusually resistant to conventional methods. They wrap themselves in cold devotion so tightly they cannot feel anything else, Kelthus explained as we planned aboard the Crimson Apostle. But your approach, exalting experience rather than domination, may be precisely what is needed. The Crimson Apostle was a drifting cathedral to chaos in all its forms. Its corridors were lined with artworks and structures expressing every flavor of corruption. Yet it was the Slaanesh precincts that truly stole my breath. There were galleries of statues that existed in more than 3 dimensions, their contours shifting in response to the viewer's emotional state. There were archives filled with books composed of raw sensation, accessed not through ink or glyphs, but via direct neural induction, meaning delivered as pure, overwhelming feeling. There were chambers aboard the Crimson Apostle, where sound itself became a living thing. In those rooms, the very atmosphere functioned as an instrument, shaped by thought and desire into symphonies no mortal orchestra could have produced. I wandered those halls for days, losing myself in their wonders, each revelation adding new strata to my understanding of what I had already become, and what heights still lay ahead. The vessel's crew, veteran space marines twisted and remade by uncounted centuries of service to chaos, treated me with a regard I had never received in all my years under the Imperial Aquila. They did not bow to my nominal rank, but to something else entirely. The unmistakable mark of one personally favored by their goddess, destined for works of significance in her name. When we finally arrived at Sanctus Seventh, the strategy we employed was not the brutal, straightforward invasion I had once associated with traitor Astartes. Instead, it was a masterstroke of quiet subversion. The world was in the midst of an agricultural crisis, its once fertile fields struggling to feed a devout population. We appeared in orbit as independent traders and benefactors, offering aid, technology, and expertise in exchange for simple trade concessions. My assignment was to interface directly with the planetary leadership. Using my heightened charisma and preternatural insight into human longing, I began nudging the ruling class toward the idea that existence could be more than endurance. Our early sessions with Governor Maltius were indistinguishable from normal negotiations. Discussions of supply lines, crop yields, infrastructure. Gradually, those meetings evolved into philosophical debates, then collaborative explorations of art and culture, and finally into intimate examinations of consciousness and meaning. Maltius was, at his core, a true believer, a sincere, disciplined servant of the Emperor, not unlike the man I once had been. Watching him wrestle with the pull of my presence, seeing his rational mind struggle to contain impulses it could not categorize, was like observing my own corruption played backward. "There is something in your proposals that disturbs me," he admitted during one of our conversations, fingers digging into his chair until the knuckles blanched. On the surface they seem sound, helpful even. Yet beneath it all, they stir thoughts I know I should not entertain. I answered with a gentle smile, calibrated to soothe while hinting at deeper possibilities. Governor, what if those thoughts are not temptations to be stamped out, but truths begging to be examined? What if the discomfort comes not from some external evil, but from your soul recognizing something it has been starved of for far too long? The discussions went on for weeks. Each encounter carried him a little further from the rigid certainties he had once held sacrosanct. I showed him paintings and sculptures that framed physical experience as something sacred rather than suspect. I played music crafted to reveal the hidden harmonies tying all living beings together. I shared writings that questioned the false separation between pleasure and spiritual ascent. His defenses did not break in a single dramatic moment. They eroded slowly and inexorably as frost dissolves in the warmth of early spring. I could pinpoint the instance when certain concepts lodged in his mind, when ideas that should have repulsed him instead lit a spark of curiosity. Curiosity that grew into fascination, and then into a desperate craving for more. His wife noticed the shift before he did. She remarked on his improved mood, on the new attention he paid to color, form, and atmosphere, on the way he had begun describing governance not as a burden, but as an art. Once Maltius fully embraced the perspectives I had offered, the planet's metamorphosis accelerated. Laws were quietly adjusted to allow greater personal expression. Worship rituals were enriched with sensory elements that made devotion visceral and immediate. Industrial efforts were reoriented so that factories produced beauty alongside necessities. Half a standard year later, Sanctus VII was scarcely recognizable. It remained a shrine world in name and habit. Its people still prayed to the emperor, still offered tithes, still upheld the rituals of imperial faith, but their conception of the divine had widened to include experiences they had once been taught to distrust. They felt his presence in touch and sensation as much as in litany, in the act of creation as much as in obedience, in the entire breadth of human experience rather than its most austere fragments. By the time the Inquisition arrived, the transformation was complete. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vex came at the head of their investigation, a man famed for a severity so uncompromising even his fellow witch hunters whispered of it. He expected to find a world rotting with obvious warped taint, ripe for exterminatus. Instead, he encountered a planet more devout, more industrious, more seemingly harmonious than any he had purged or spared. I greeted him in the governor's palace, in a reception hall that had become a cathedral to refined sensation. Animated tapestries lined the walls, their patterns shifting subtly in response to the emotional states of the viewers. The floor was a mosaic of precious stones that emitted soft tones when stepped upon, turning every movement into a note in a living composition. Braziers released carefully crafted scents that sharpened perception and emotional nuance rather than simply masking the smell of incense and sweat. Vex stood rigid in the midst of it all, his power armor brutal and angular against the flowing lines around him. His expression was carved in granite, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He was searching for clear markers of blasphemy and finding only exuberant, if unconventional, worship. "Lucien Vere," he said at last, voice ringing with the practiced authority of a man used to being believed. "You are accused of leading this world astray, of diverting loyal subjects from pure imperial reverence into practices that brush dangerously close to heresy." I approached him with unhurried steps, moving with the fluid ease that now came as naturally as breathing. As I neared, I could feel his instincts screaming that I was dangerous, even as his conscious mind struggled to define how. "Inquisitor," I answered, layering my voice with that precise balance of humility and resonance that his augmetic ears could not help but register. "I see no heresy here, only a populace that has discovered deeper wells of devotion to the Emperor's majesty. Look around you. Have you ever witnessed citizens more joyous in their labor, more inventive in their praise, more determined to craft beauty in his honor?" His gaze swept the transformed chamber, the vibrant iconography, the subtly altered symbols, the architecture that felt more alive than stone should be. When he faced me again, suspicion warred visibly with confusion. The reports spoke of visions. he said, the certainty in his tone beginning to fray. Of phenomena beyond normal human experience, of practices that... He faltered, unable to dress his unease in doctrinal language. There is something amiss here, even if I cannot name it. I smiled once more, a welcoming curve of the lips edged with hints of forbidden understanding. What if what you sense is not wrongness, but a more complete rightness than you have ever encountered? What if the unease comes from recognizing truths your training has taught you to distrust? The Emperor built humanity with a capacity for joy, for appreciation, for experiences that go far beyond survival and rote obedience. Is it not an act of worship to explore all he made possible? His hand drifted toward his holstered bolt pistol, but it was a symbolic gesture more than a real threat. Outside the hall, life on Sanctus 7 continued uninterrupted. People walked the streets with an ease and contentment that no amount of stagecraft could counterfeit. Children laughed as they played games that combined athleticism with creativity. Workers toiled with enthusiasm, their productivity soaring alongside their delight in the tasks at hand. "I ought to kill you where you stand," Vex muttered, though his words lacked the iron they should have carried. "I ought to order a cleansing bombardment and burn away whatever contagion you have loosed upon this world, but you see no torment," I finished for him gently. "No chains, no degradation. You see a people genuinely happier than they have ever been. You see the Emperor's light burning brighter than before, only refracted through angles no catechism ever prepared you to recognize." Our confrontation stretched on for hours. He hunted for solid proof of blasphemy. I responded with example after example of what we had wrought. I showed him artists whose works praised the Emperor with a passion that bordered on ecstasy. I presented laborers whose refined appreciation of sensation made them more precise and efficient. I brought forth soldiers who viewed war not as mere duty, but as a deadly art, their skills elevated to the edge of the superhuman. With each instance, his confidence eroded further. What he saw with his own eyes contradicted all he had been taught about chaos's touch. The people were not broken, not rebellious, not casting off imperial authority. They remained loyal, fervently so, only now their devotion had become richer, more exuberant, less bound by old strictures. The decisive moment came when Governor Maltius arrived with a delegation of the most respected citizens. They spoke of their love for the Emperor with such intensity that it seemed to blaze from their faces. Their words rang with conviction, joy, and an unmistakable spiritual fervor that even a hardened inquisitor could not dismiss as mere play-acting. "Inquisitor Vex," Maltius said, his voice now bearing its own subtle harmonics born of his transformation. "We have never before been so faithful to the Emperor's will. We have never worked harder, nor found deeper meaning in our service. If this is what you call heresy, then it has brought us closer to the Golden Throne than any cold orthodoxy ever did." I watched Vex's expression as those words sank in. I saw the precise instant when the last remnants of his certainty collapsed. How could he damn a world whose people were more devout, more productive, more visibly fulfilled than they had ever been? How could he justify annihilating citizens whose supposed crime was discovering greater depth in truths they had always professed? "I will be observing you," he said finally, his tone trying and failing to reclaim its former edge. The slightest hint of true corruption, the smallest piece of evidence that this enhancement hides genuine heresy, and I will return with the full wrath of the Inquisition. We both knew he would not. What we had wrought on Sanctus VII was too effective, too visibly beneficial, too resistant to simple condemnation. Others of his order might come in time, but they would face the same conundrum. A world that defied corruption's usual markers, yet was unmistakably changed. After he departed, I climbed to the highest tower of the palace and looked down upon the transformed planet. Cities glimmered with new elegance, their structures adorned with details designed to make daily life a quiet joy. People moved with a grace and purpose that testified to their expanded understanding of what existence could be. Even the farmlands bore the mark of change. Fields had been arranged into vast patterns that formed living artworks when seen from orbit, all while producing harvests that surpassed any previous record. And in that moment, I understood what Slaanesh truly offered. Not the crude filth paraded in imperial propaganda, but the elevation of experience to such heights that ordinary life became dull by comparison. The power to draw significance from every breath, every touch, every sound. The transformation of existence into a continuous act of creation, a living artwork honoring the full potential of sentient beings. I was no longer merely human. In stepping outside the narrow bounds the Emperor's servants had set, I'd become something far beyond anything I'd once imagined for myself. My awareness had stretched to encompass layers of reality that most minds would never even suspect existed. My sense of beauty, of pleasure, of meaning itself had evolved past the crude parameters of my original conditioning. The whispers that had once seduced me from the edges of sleep were no longer whispers. They had become an ongoing conversation with powers that existed beyond the material cosmos. With each exchange, new possibilities for experience unfolded before me. Through Slaanesh's guidance, I'd come to see that the boundary between self and universe was an illusion, one that could be dissolved by those willing to relinquish the safety of smallness. Standing in that tower, feeling the world below thrum with renewed life, I realized my work had only just begun. Sanctus Asvent was proof of concept, not culmination. There were countless other worlds waiting, countless populations ready, knowingly or not, for revelation. The righteous indignation hung in orbit above, its crew entirely remade. They still bore imperial heraldry, still flew under the Emperor's banner, but inside they were something entirely new. Beings who had transcended their old programming while appearing, on paper, as loyal as ever. They would accompany me wherever the Dark Prince directed, carrying this exquisite contagion from system to system. Other ships would be drawn in, their crews unable to ignore the evident superiority of what we had become. In time, we would return to the core territories of the Imperium itself. We would bring our methods to those who had never even dreamed such possibilities existed. The ecclesiarchy would find itself struggling to denounce practices that so plainly intensified devotion. The administratum would hesitate to reject systems that dramatically improved productivity and citizen satisfaction. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus would be forced to note that our innovations, guided by aesthetics as much as logic, consistently outperformed purely utilitarian designs. The Imperium would be altered from the inside out, not through revolt, not through open war, but through the impossible-to-resist allure of lives no longer starved of true experience. People would welcome the change. They would clamor for it. They would thank us for it. And through all of this, I would serve as the conduit, the link between mortal limitation and transcendent possibility, the guide who showed them how to become more than they were, without losing the core of what made them human. Corruption would spread like fire through a drought-stricken forest, each newly awakened soul becoming another source of the beautiful blaze that would one day remake the galaxy. This, I understood at last, was what it meant to belong to Slaanesh. Not to lose oneself, but to discover what the self could be once every false shackle had been shrugged off. Not to abandon purpose, but to expand it until it touched the infinite. Not damnation, but awakening. Not decay, but ascension. Not an ending, a beginning. The stars stretched out before us, each one a potential canvas for transformation. And I, Lucien Veillard, once a dutiful servant of the Emperor and now champion of transcendent experience, would be the instrument of that transformation. The void between suns no longer felt empty. It thrummed with promise, singing in chords of pleasure and revelation beyond the reach of unaltered minds. In the end, corruption had not been something inflicted on me from without. It was a path I had chosen, a truth I had embraced, an identity I had grown into. And in accepting it, I had finally learned what it meant to truly live.